Well, I guess the answer is yes. All right. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Santa Clarita Valley Groundwater Sustainability Agency's Board of Directors. We will start today's meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. Repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Very good. Thank you. I will start the meeting with some announcements for today. Here we go. This meeting is being conducted in person at the SCV Water Agency's Rio Vista Water Treatment Plant Boardroom. As a convenience to the public, members of the public may also participate virtually by logging on to the agency's Zoom meeting. Any member of the public may listen to the meeting or make comments to the board using the call-in number or Zoom webinar link. Okay. In the event there is a disruption of service which prevents the agency from broadcasting the meeting to members of the public using either the call-in option or the internet-based service, this meeting will not be postponed or rescheduled, but will continue without remote participation. This remote participation option is being provided as a convenience to the public and is not required. Members of the public are welcome to attend the meeting in person. We encourage you to come on down. To participate in public comment from your computer, tablet, or smartphone, when I announce the agenda item, you wish to speak on, click the raise hand feature in Zoom. You'll be notified when it's your turn to speak. Please unmute when requested. If you're on phone, to participate in public comment via the phone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, dial *9 to raise your hand. When it's your turn to speak, dial *6 to unmute yourself. Anyone remember *69? That just came to mind, but I think we're all dating ourselves. Okay, Uni, do we have public present? I think we do. We'll call them public. I'd like to remind you that if you're attending in person, there are public comment cards, little blue cards on the table outside. Please complete and return them. Please complete them, return them to the board secretary to help expedite public comments. So if you'd like to make a public comment, grab one of the blue cards outside. The procedures for today's meeting are as follows. I'll introduce each agenda item. Staff will present. I'll ask for public comments. I'll then ask for discussion and question from board members. And then once that's concluded, if it's an action item, I'll ask for a motion and a second. I don't believe we have any on the agenda today, though. After any further discussion, the board secretary will call for roll call votes. Okay, so I believe that we have several alternates joining us today and some absences. Uni, could you give us a rundown of those attendance?
Absolutely. We have Director Jeff Ford alternating for Director William Cooper. We have Director Lauren West alternating for Director Jason Gibbs.
Very good. Okay, I think that takes us to agenda item 1.3, public comments. So members of the public may comment as to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of this agency that are not on the agenda at this time. We ask that members of the public wishing to comment on items that are listed on this agenda to do so at the time each item is considered. Uni, are there public comments on items not covered in the agenda?
There is none at this time.
And in person, doesn't look like it either. Okay, so that will conclude item 1.3, public comments. I'd like to move to item 1.4, that's approval of the agenda. Directors, are there any changes, additions, or modifications to the agenda? Oh, no. Excuse me, that's my kid walking home from school. Okay, I don't see any. I think that Uni, I think we can move on. No vote needed for that. No changes.
No vote is needed.
Very good. Let's move on to item 2.1 then. So item 2.1 might be my favorite item of the agenda. This is new appointment and reappointments of the SCV GSA Board of Directors and alternate Board of Directors for the 2024 through 2026 term. I believe, Mr. Cole, you'll be presenting this item.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bryden. This is basically just a informational item. So each member of the JPA has the opportunity to reappoint or appoint new members to serve on the Santa Clarita Valley Groundwater Sustainability Agency Board of Directors. We've received those letters, and the agenda item lists those members that have been chosen by their respective agencies. And that concludes my report.
Very good. I think the agenda item I'm waiting for will be on the next meeting's agenda. Okay, that concludes item 2.1. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Oh, sure. Are there any comments from board directors?
President Byrd, it was a President Bryden, it was a pleasure to serve on the SCV GSA Board of Directors. Upon my recommendation and support of SCV Water Board of Directors, Director Dirk Marks will step into my role as acting director on the next term. Director Marks' firm grasp of Santa Clarita Valley's groundwater resources, along with his expertise with our groundwater sustainability plan, makes him highly qualified to serve as director on this board. As SCV Water's former water resources manager, he oversaw preparation of the groundwater sections of the 2010, 2015, 2020 Urban Water Management Plan that summarized groundwater issues facing our valley. He was involved with the formation of this GSA and helped guide the analytic analysis in the GSP, including the foundational groundwater modeling. Director Marks unequivocally will make a larger impact on SCV GSA than what I can bring to this board. So please extend a warm welcome to Director Marks at our next regular board meeting. Mr. Ford, Mr. Peters, and myself will serve as alternates. Back to you, President Bryden.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your service and welcome. Okay, so I skipped over public comments. Were there any comments on this item?
There is none.
Okay, thank you for that. Continuing director discussion, any additional discussion? Okay, very good. We'll move on to the next item. I believe that takes us to item 3.1. This is approval of the consent calendar. Is there any public comment on the consent calendar?
There's none at this time.
Okay, any board discussion? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion?
President Bryden, I'll motion to approve.
Thank you. Second?
I'll second that.
Very good. Uni, roll call vote, please. Or discussion. Oh, wow, I'm in such a hurry today. Any discussion from board members? Seeing none, Uni, roll call vote, please.
When I call your name, please state your vote. Director Ford,
Yes.
Director Ozanski,
Yes.
Director West,
Aye.
Vice President Martin,
Yes.
and President Bryden.
Yes,
Thank you. This item has passed.
very good. Thank you, Uni. Takes us to item 4.1. This will be a quarterly status update of our groundwater sustainability plans implementation. I believe this will be presented by Mr. Verduz.
Yes, thank you, President Bryden. And while the presentation is loading, this is one of the two information items today. We just have a few slides on this. Thanks, Uni. Okay, next slide, please. Great, thanks, Uni. So groundwater dependent ecosystem monitoring. We have the monitoring is going to be starting up again in the riverbed area. We provided a report to your board on Santa Clara River groundwater dependent ecosystem monitoring several meetings ago. We'll be doing that again. This is an opportunity for us to work with 5 Point, which is the downstream landowner. Unlike the first batch of groundwater dependent ecosystem monitoring we did in the river, which was just focused upstream from I-5, this next batch will include land owned by 5 Point. So it's an opportunity for us to work with 5 Point's biologists, train them, demonstrate to them how we're doing it, and to continue to work with them moving forward in the future. We're also still working with 5 Point. We're waiting on a final list from them to prioritize equipment replacement. We've talked in the past and I think even had a few chuckles about some of the equipment we lost with all the rain and the scour in the river. 5 Point's no exception. They've lost at least one well and most of their temperature probes. So we'll be prioritizing equipment replacement with 5 Point. Upland biologic monitoring is also something that we're planning to get off the ground. The groundwater sustainability plan includes as an implementation task looking at upland biologic areas, primarily with oak trees. Our biologist identified 7 or 8 sites as candidate sites to go take a look. About half those sites are on private property. We haven't had success getting access. So the number of sites we'll be looking at is a little bit lower this year than what we wanted, but something's better than nothing. So we plan to get that going. And this will be mainly looking at upland oak tree areas. Next slide, please. And it's official. See, last time I told you it would be official, although it was somewhat tongue in cheek. But it is official now. The grant is awarded. Last time we talked, we were in the draft award stage. So we've made it through the final award stage. So this is great news. Grants are important to the public agencies just because of the cost of these things. This one is going to be about $5.3 million total. Unlike other grants that the GSA has obtained, this one is a 100% grant, which is amazing. It will mainly include 2 focuses. One, installing deep wells in the Saugus Aquifer. That's going to help us fill more data gaps in this aquifer. And then also looking at private wells, doing a valley-wide look at private wells will help us understand, how many are there? Are there some that might be available for monitoring? So we've got a couple months until the grant agreement comes our way. So between now and then, we'll be working on a request for proposals, both to get the work going. So far, so good. We'll update you next round on that. Next slide, please. Yes. So our last meeting, we spent a fair amount of time talking about how to navigate the governor's executive order and the responsibilities that have now been put on GSAs and the counties to review well permits. Since our last meeting, we had one submission of a private well review. We completed that review. It was for a de minimis well, serving a single family residence. And we endorsed the form that basically, and I don't expect your board to remember this, but just as a quick reminder, there were 2 tracks. If it was a de minimis well, we'd handle it at the staff level and communicate back with the county. That's what took place here. We told the county it was a de minimis well, county, go ahead, complete the permitting. And so that's what they've done. We have another one coming down the line. Next slide, please. We're told we have another one coming down the line in this portion of the basin. We don't know very much about it other than that we believe it will be a de minimis well that will go along with construction of a new single family home in that area. So the process that your board approved for us worked pretty well. So that's all good news. And we'll keep you posted as more of these come through. Next slide, please. Look ahead. So on with filling data gaps again. We're looking to get a consultant on board to help us with the land surface elevation monitoring that's called for in the GSP. That's for looking at subsidence. The grant agreement is coming down the line. We're working with GeoSyntech on the data management system. This is the computer database that's required by the regulations. So the data management system is moving forward. Well permitting, we'll see what this next year holds. We've got one down, second one on the way. We'll be keeping our eye out for the DWR comments on the groundwater sustainability plan. Those are due no later than January. So hopefully we'll receive them before then, but and when I say no later than January, I mean no later than the end of January. So hopefully we'll have comments to share with your board at our January meeting. But if the comments don't come in time, we won't. And we'll continue to work on the flow model. And that concludes this brief presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Let's start with public comment. Any public comment?
There is none at this time.
Okay, directors?
I just had one. What was the amount for a de minimis well? What was the flow amount?
It is 2 acre-feet or less per year.
Okay, and the above 2 acre is a major permit.
Above 2 acre-feet is
The other track.
The other
non-de
track.
minimis.
Non-de minimis track, the big track. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
That says it.
Very
Okay.
good. Other comments? Oh, both. Peter.
Mr. Briggs, what sort of comments can we expect? Hopefully in January. What kind of feedback? I mean, I know everything's hypothetical and we haven't received anything yet, but are there any expectations for any particular comments on our GSP in any of the sections?
That's a good question. And frankly, I don't know what kinds of comments we might get from DWR on our GSP. We've seen them provide comments in other basins with different conditions. And those comments have ranged from everything about public outreach. I feel like our GSA did a real good job with that. Other comments have related to integration of plans together. We don't have that complication here. We have one basin and one GSP. Other comments have been about groundwater dependent ecosystems in other basins. So I'm not exactly sure what kind of comments we will receive. We did look at the public comments provided to the Department of Water Resources shortly after the plan was provided to DWR. So after this GSA provided its plan to the Department of Water Resources, it opened up its own public comment period. There were some public comments provided then, which were similar comments, similar people who commented on our GSP, making similar comments to the GSA. Whether or not the Department of Water Resources will take those and turn them around and ask us to respond a second time, I don't know. But we'd be prepared to do that if that happened.
Any comments that you've seen from other GSAs, from other agencies regarding methodology or measurement, analytics?
Nothing that jumps out. I think in the Central Valley, the key issues that some of the GSAs faced were that their plans weren't compatible with adjoining basins or adjoining GSAs. That's not an issue for us here. Mr. Cole, I don't know if you have any.
No, I think you've done a great job of answering Mr. Vigutz. Yeah, it's a hypothetical question. I think we try to do a really good job of answering the questions that we received from interested parties in the community. And we provided those responses as well as part of the process. So yeah, it's tough to know. The only other thing I'll add in the Central Valley, really the prime component other than, the adjoining groundwater basins is the subsidence issue that is well publicized there. We don't see those types of activities here in the community. We are going to have nonetheless a robust subsidence monitoring program. But yeah, I think you answered sufficiently. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Kroll. Thank you, Mr. Goods. Back to you, President Biden.
Very good.
Thank you, President Bryden. Real quick, I don't think we can say too often how much we appreciate the team's efforts to win these grants. Every time we win a grant of this magnitude, it saves our ratepayers the money that's going to take to put in place these projects that we need to develop the information. And with that, Rick, can you say a little more about what we intend to accomplish with the well in the Saugus Aquifer?
Sure. So this grant would fund installation of, and I may not have the numbers exactly right, half a dozen deep Saugus Aquifer wells that would be screened in multiple depths. So these are wells that will be 1,000+ feet deep. They'll be geophysically logged. So in that process, we'll learn more about the geology. That will help us understand whether or not our model layering is where it needs to be. With the wells will be screened in multiple zones. That will open up the ability for us to get water level in discrete zones of the Saugus Aquifer. We have some of that ability right now with a relatively limited number of deep Saugus wells. That'll help us with understanding water quality better. It'll also provide us data on water levels in the different zones, which will go into improve our understanding of the aquifer, what the hydraulic heads are in the aquifer, and that will lead into future model improvements. So there'll be a lot of new lines of data that come in with those wells.
Very good. Thank you, Rick, and thank you again, Hallie. Thank your staff for the efforts to win this grant. Certainly helps our agency.
Okay. Director Ford.
Thank you, President Biden. Yeah, job well done on the grant stuff. I second that.
Thank you.
One more thing I was going to ask on subsidence. This used to be called way back when. Have you guys, the staff, thought about locations where we're going to focus the monitoring effort for that? Is it more heavily weighted towards alluvium or Saugus Formation or something like that? Or where would the monitoring go on for subsidence?
Great question. Yes, we've thought about it. We have a map. I don't have it here with me, that identifies the prime area for subsidence monitoring. It is to monitor subsidence or subsidence in the Saugus Formation. And it'll be focused around where we expect future groundwater levels to go lower than they've been in the past, such as with V201, with increased Saugus pumping related to the traditional way of handling perchlorate in the basin. So there are areas in the basin where groundwater elevations are forecasted to go lower than they have been in the past. And so we'll be looking at those areas in particular, not only those areas, but definitely in those areas.
Okay. Thank you, Rick.
Director West.
Is there any relationship or anything you would study regarding subsidence and how it's affected by earthquake faults?
No, not directly. We will have monitoring points on both sides of the San Gabriel Fault and the Halser Fault. We'll be citing them to be in the most competent rock we can find. That might help us understand tectonic movement.
Now we have faults that go right through the center of the city, across Whitaker Burmite, and then across some of my parks, which were well set back from with any structures. So I was just curious if you want to take a look at that.
Additional thoughts? Okay, if not, I think this is an informational item. So we'll wrap it up there. Okay, I think that takes us to item 4.2. This is a status on model calibration and anticipated next steps toward revision of sustainable management criteria for groundwater levels. And Mr. Dukes, I think this is you again.
Yes, it is. Today, it's not just me, though. John Porcello is here. John works with SCV Water and the GSA has for many years as our groundwater modeling expert. So John will talk about some of this today as well. So with that, I will jump in. Oh, also made a note here to, in addition to John being here today, some of the graphics that are prepared today were prepared by Geosyntec. Also want to give credit to them. They've been a big help to us in visualizing data here in the Valley. So, all right, with that, let me jump in. I see Uni, you've got the slide up there. Thank you. So this is an information item. It's an update. We've given your board little peeks under the tent, so to speak, as we've learned more about model calibration over the last several months. And this is will be a longer discussion on the items. So our groundwater sustainability plan was adopted in January 2022 after a multi-year study. That plan and the model that underpins the planning have a huge amount of information in them. Data about water levels, groundwater extraction, land use, etc. Very strong data set. That data set has been strengthened. Since then, we have more years of water level data since the plan was adopted, hydrology data. And you'll see today we've really made great progress on filling a number of data gaps. Further, that flow model used in the GSP, it did a very detailed look at future pumping in the basin through build out. We assigned climate change factors, and it found that the proposed pumping plan was sustainable under these expected climate change and development scenarios. You'll hear today about the importance of monitoring too. You know, life isn't all about these groundwater flow models, of course, right? Monitoring and adapting are also key to implementing the GSP. Next slide, please. Okay. So implementing the GSP requires we constantly improve our understanding of the basin. We do that through not just routine monitoring, but through filling data gaps, through studies that are needed. Our GSA is no different than the other GSAs throughout the state. The Department of Water Resources recognized that GSAs would have data gaps, monitoring would be required. So we're chipping away on this, just like the other 200 or 220 or so GSAs in the state. Monitoring helps us with adaptive management. We've talked about minimum thresholds. We've talked about GDE triggers in the past. Monitoring helps understand whether or not we think we're heading towards undesirable results, and it can lead us in the direction of pursuing an adaptive management strategy. There are a number of strategies already laid out in the GSP for this. So monitoring is important as well. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about data gaps here. Your board is aware that we installed piezometers in the river. We installed 2 shallow wells in the river upstream from Interstate 5. 5-point installed wells downstream from Interstate 5. And we continue to chip away at anything that is fuzzy in terms of data. So we're getting dialed in with river monitoring. We've surveyed not just these GDE wells, but all the agency wells. We've updated elevations and hydrology, meaning pumping records, rainfall, etc. We've invested a lot of money in filling these data gaps, and so that we can better manage the basin. And that information's been loaded into the flow model. Okay, next slide, please. So the flow model covers the entire basin. The entire basin is about 100 square miles or so in size, give or take. We focused this filling of data gaps in a lot of these areas on the map here. The groundwater dependent ecosystem areas, the river areas. Oops, excuse me. In this graphic, you'll see along the main stem of the Santa Clara River, and looking at it at this distance, it's hard to see, but Interstate 5 comes up through the bottom center of that map and arcs up. You see where Interstate 5 comes up. There's a little pink dot there. That's our GDEB well. Oh, thank you, whoever's doing that. Appreciate that. Thanks, Tom. So GDEB is there just south of Round Mountain. We'll talk about that today. GDEA is a little bit further east. That well happens to be located between approximately the N wells and the S wells, and what I used to call the Bunny Love baseball fields back in the day. And then further west, there are wells that were installed by 5 Point. You'll see C and D and E further downstream. One or more of those wells has been washed out with the recent storms. So this is just to orient you. So today I'm going to talk about GDEA and GDEB, and I think we'll mention GDEC a time or two. So this is just to get you oriented. John will also have some slides where he talks about this area, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about some of the groundwater flow velocities around GDEB and around the north side of Round Mountain. So John will have some slides on that. Next slide, please. So we're going to just run through some of these things. After those GDE wells were installed, the team went out and did some initial surveying. This surveying was done by SCV Water. It has a very high-tech GPS survey tool. We looked at the thalwags, or the lowest spots in the creeks near the GDE wells, to get an idea of their elevation relative to the groundwater elevation. This was useful work, and the nice thing about using this kind of tool is it's fairly quick. Each setup takes a minute or so. Drawbacks to this tool are that if there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of cover, the satellite signal doesn't work. So this particular tool works well where there's open sky. We've also, not shown on the picture, we've also had some survey transects done through these areas through GDE A and B with a licensed land surveyor. And we've also had a LiDAR survey done looking at a broader area. And one nice thing with that is that's not as impeded by the vegetation and things of that nature. So we have much better elevation control. You'll see the benefit of that on some slides in the future here. Okay, next slide, please. We surveyed the temperature probes that we mentioned have been installed in the river. This probe was one of the probes north of GDEA. SCV Water and 5 Point lost most of the temperature probes that were installed with the strong rains we've had this year. So we're comparing information with 5 Point on how best to move forward. Is this the right kind of way to monitor in the future? Yes or no? We're looking at that. The temperature data is helpful. It's not part of what's required in the GSP monitoring program, but it's helpful to us. And so we're looking at ways to improve the temperature probe and the temperature monitoring moving forward. But unfortunately, these are shallow devices that are prone to being washed away in flood. Next slide, please. This is one of the GDEA wells. This is a photograph looking down the steel case at the top of the well. The orange cap is designed to keep things out of the well that aren't supposed to be in the well, like debris. We measure this well and the other well downstream. 5 Points helps us measuring their wells further downstream. All these wells were carefully surveyed. When we measure them, we measure to the top of that plastic pipe. That's called top of casing. And from that, we compute the elevation of the groundwater. Before we had these, we used the flow model to estimate groundwater elevations, but that is, that's not really the best way to do it. These wells have helped quite a bit. Next slide, please. This is GDEB. So this is the well closer to I-5 that I mentioned earlier today. Clearly in this photograph, it's very dry in this area. You can see the grass is dry and brittle. Away from that well, if we were to walk out there and approach that well and go past that well, we would go down into the river where there's a little bit of water surfacing, or at least there was at that time. With the storms this year, this area was overtopped by maybe 6 inches or a foot. The vegetation was disturbed, sediments were put in that, but the piezometer is still there. The footing, the well casing did its job with that high water. The other nice thing about this well is when we drilled that well, it allowed us to get a better handle on the depth of the alluvium or the thickness of the alluvium. Our earlier understanding of the thickness of the alluvium was a little bit too generous. We had too much alluvium in there. By drilling a boring here, we were able to get better understanding of how thick the alluvium is. Next slide, please. This is a pressure transducer. We have these in the GDE wells. They measure water pressure. They go down beneath the water in the well, and they will record data every, John, I don't know what the cycle is. It's every 10 minutes or perhaps hour.
Yeah, I think it's even every minute or so.
Every minute or so. And so what these tools do is they will measure the data, measure the depth of the water frequently. You can imagine their data will produce a very nice continuous chart of water levels. About once a quarter, we go out here though, and we trust but verify. We take the data logger out, we download the data, and then we'll gauge that well with a manual measurement, just to make sure that the manual measurement tracks with what the data logger is collecting. And then these also collect temperature data. So these are very useful tools that have really helped improve our understanding of water levels and sensitivity of water levels, for example, to precipitation events. Next slide, please. This is underneath Interstate 5. This is an area that we photograph. We do these panoramic pictures when we're down there, at least I do. The GDEB well is roughly where that blue star is. And this is just a panoramic. Sometimes there's more water here, sometimes there's less. There have been times in the past where this area has been very dry. And there have been times, such as recently, where there's been more water in this area. Next slide, please. Okay. I'm going to go through some geologic cross sections. I'll spend a little bit of time on the first few just so your board can get the gist of it, and then I might go a little bit faster on the others just in the interest of time. But if you have questions, I can answer them as well. Next slide, please, Uni. So this is a cross section through GDEB. This is the one just upstream from Interstate 5. And if we go back in time and we think about what the groundwater sustainability plan said, it said we would monitor these GDE areas. We would use these piezometers, and we would set these things called GDE triggers, which were set in this location 2 feet above the anticipated historic low in these areas. So these GDE triggers are groundwater elevations by their nature, they're below ground surface. I'll zoom in here in a minute, but what you can see on this is the topography available at the time was fairly, it almost looks from this level like it's composed of a series of straight lines. It's fairly rough. This was from a digital elevation model. And let's go to the next slide, Uni, where we zoom in a little bit. So in this area, what we found now that we have an actual piezometer in the ground, we can see that the red dot and the dashed line right below it, which are the GDE trigger and the minimum threshold, they're too high. And you'll see this in another section, but these are too high. They need to be underground because they're for monitoring groundwater elevations. So we've worked quite a bit to dial this in with new information that we've put in the flow model with elevation data, groundwater elevation data, et cetera. Let's go to the next slide, please, Uni. Okay, so we've improved this, and it may be hard for you to see. We'll zoom in on this one too, but remember the last one where we had the land surface that kind of looked like it was a series of straight lines? And you'll see here that the thickness of the alluvium is quite a bit thinner here. The first one I showed had a big sort of U-shaped section of alluvium in it. This is much thinner, and it's informed because we drilled a boring there. Next slide, please, Uni. So here we have much thinner alluvium. We still have the issue, though, with these triggers and minimum thresholds being too high. So we'll talk about another section here in a moment. And I guess the point I just want to raise is that as we chip away at getting better elevations, getting surveys, it becomes more clear how we need to adjust these. When we developed the GSP, we knew that there was going to be some adjustment needed, but we had to wrap our arms around these unknowns. And so we're much closer to that now. Next slide, please. This is GDE cross-section C. So this is further downstream. This is roughly north of the Magic Mountain parking lot. You'll see similar sort of coarse ground surface elevations based on the digital elevation model. Next slide, please. So zooming in, we have a similar issue here. The red dot and the minimum threshold are above the land surface. They need to be lower. Next slide, please. Updated survey, this one with the LiDAR survey. You can see the elevation control is much better here. Next slide, please. Still though, with the placement of the piezometer, we see that its thresholds are too high. So this is part of filling data gaps and getting more detailed information about each of these sites. Before we had this, we used the digital elevation model that has resolution, a data point roughly every 1,000 square feet, and it's a coarser data set. And it's just not as good as what we need now that we're doing implementation here. Okay, next slide, please, Uni. All right. So I've shared with you these GDE cross sections and what we've learned with them. Next, I'm going to turn this over to John, and John can talk to you about how we've taken that information that we've collected and folded it into the flow model and adjusted the flow model. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Good afternoon, everyone. John Porcello from GSI Water Solutions. I've been the lead hydrologist, groundwater modeler, working in the basin for a number of years now. I think I'll start by just reviewing again that we have 4 sets of data now in the central part of the basin for the alluvial aquifer that we didn't have before, that really fill some key data gaps, and Rick has spent, some time going over those in particular. But basically, right in that area where the Santa Clara River is passing along the south side of Round Mountain, flowing underneath I-5, moving downstream towards where the Valencia WRP is located. There really weren't any wells in that area before, and now we have these piezometers that help us understand the system. So in that particular area, there are 3 new GDE piezometers, the GDE A, B, and C that Rick went over. There's another couple further downstream, GDE D down by the mouth of Castaic Creek. That was actually one that got washed out in the floods last winter. But we had data for close to a year, maybe a little longer than that before that happened. And then another one that 5 Point had also installed further downstream near the mouth of Potrero Canyon. So we had a year plus or minus of data for water levels at these 5 piezometers. As Rick mentioned, we have some information now at GDEB in particular about how thick the alluvium is. We had the LiDAR survey and these on the ground field transects that Rick mentioned earlier. And I really want to emphasize that LiDAR survey in particular, because it gives data at a very high density spatially of what that ground surface elevation looks like. So that's very helpful for putting that in the groundwater flow model to help with evaluating the groundwater surface water interactions that occur between the streams and the alluvial aquifer, just for establishing ground surface with finer resolution than we had before, which helps also with the evapotranspiration component that we simulate in the model for that water that's being taken up from the water table by vegetation. So to me, that LiDAR survey in particular was a really big deal including also the piezometers, of course. The wellhead surveys were important because that reaffirmed the elevations that we were working with for calibration of the model. And then stream flow data. There's been a dedicated gauge over at the Old Road Bridge that the USGS and the county have maintained for a number of years. But in addition to that, LA County Sanitation District has been doing some periodic flow monitoring, generally on a monthly basis for a few years. And we had access to that data that we also considered as we were refining the calibration of the model in this central part of the basin. So those are 4, I tend to think of those as kind of structural data sets. They describe the physics of the system, how is the system laid out geographically, structurally, in its geology, that sort of thing. And then in addition to those structural items, we had, from a timing sense, we had 3 more years of data throughout the groundwater basin, so we could extend our calibration timeline 3 more years than we had at the time that we submitted the groundwater sustainability plan. So we've put those 3 additional years of data into the model. That's rainfall information, stream flow information, groundwater elevations where we have them at wells throughout the valley, and of course, groundwater pumping records. So those all went into the model, and then we spent time primarily looking in this central part of the basin at first, how did the model as we had it at the end of the development of the GSP replicate the most recent 3 years of data? How did it look after we made the adjustments to things like ground surface and alluvium thickness? And then we did some work saying, okay, yeah, over here it still looks pretty good. Oh, we've got some improvement we should try to do over here. And so what I'm going to walk you through are basically 3 ways we have to display to you the what this new model looks like, the resulting improved calibration in this part of the basin. So I'm going to give you a couple other different views of the the model layering near that GDEB piezometer. We'll then talk about the hydraulic conductivity values and groundwater flow rates, which are what we adjust in the model when we're trying to match groundwater level data that we have at specific wells. And then we'll look at some time series plots for those wells. So next slide, please. So here's another one of these sections. This is in the vicinity of GDEB. Now, what makes this one different from the section you saw earlier is the orientation. We're looking west to east. So west on the left side, east on the right side. And on the little graphic down at the bottom on that aerial photo, you'll see the red line. We're basically following the axis, the bed of the Santa Clara River itself. And that other transects that you were seeing earlier, those were north-south, so they were perpendicular to the river, unlike this one. And GDEB is basically over in the left part of the cross section here, but you can see that we've got the alluvium in the tan color, the Saugus Formation in the yellow color beneath it, and the red line is just the contact of that surface, the base of the alluvium and the top of the Saugus Formation. This was what we had in the model before, and the next slide shows what we have now as we look along the axis of the river. GDEB is over on the left side of this area where the alluvium is thinnest. And imagine going downstream, in the downstream direction along the river, okay? Start where it says east and work your way west. What's happening is in the eastern area, which is just a little bit downstream of the end wells, we do have a thick alluvial sequence there. We know it from the well logs we have at the end wells and the S wells. We've got a log up on the north side around Mountain, an old Valencia well. It was called Well I, that tells us the same thing. But what we know now is that, you know, as we move from east to west and we start getting closer to Round Mountain, that Round Mountain, which is an outcrop of the Saugus Formation, I mean, it's at ground surface at the mountain, and it's passing just beneath the riverbed in the area where the GDEB piezometer is. So when you look at that contact line between the tan and the yellow color, we're going upwards as we move from east to west, because of that structural feature of what Round Mountain is, which is an uplifted outcrop of the Saugus Formation. Next slide. This is a plan view map from the model, a little geeky, but that's the way these things tend to look. And what we're looking at here in the color schemes is in the uppermost model layer, we have the Saugus Formation in that brownish red sandstone color. It's lying south of the alluvium and north of the alluvium. I've also labeled Round Mountain, which is the Saugus outcrop there. And then the other colors are basically representing different parts of the alluvium that, you know, for me, as I study the data at each well, and I think about the flow paths, and I think about the slope of the water table as we understand it between wells, and as I think about how maybe the variations in water levels at one well look different in one place than they do in another, I tend to think of these kind of spatial sub areas of the alluvial system. And other researchers who've worked out here have done the same thing. You can see some of these concepts for some of the geology reports and hydrogeology reports, for example, that Richard Slade Associates has done over the years, kind of carving up the alluvium into different subregions in terms of thinking about how they behave similarly or differently. And so in this area, that light blue in the right area there, that's in the vicinity of the end wells. San Francisco Canyon is coming down from the north on the purple area there. And the area that's passing along the south side of Round Mountain was previously thought in that orange color to essentially be conveying water from east to west over a fairly large area south of Round Mountain, and even including, potentially some of the water that was coming out of the South Fork drainage alluvium and entering the main alluvial corridor of the Santa Clara River. And so you see those red arrows are flow arrows, just showing in a kind of semi-quantitative, qualitative sense, just the general differences in groundwater flow rates, flow velocities. So we had some, modest flow passing beneath south of the Round Mountain area, but over kind of a broad area. We also had a fair amount of flow passing to the north of Round Mountain. And then as it's moving past Round Mountain, we had a pretty wide valley for that water to move into in the green area west of Interstate 5. That was the model before. The next slide shows how we conceptualize that now. And so there are a couple of things. First off, that orange area is much narrower in extent. The area south of there, there is a log that actually indicates that there is only very thin pocket of alluvium to the south on one of the wells. I can't read it, that's sitting down there. But what we now show, and we really, even though the thickness of the alluvium is less on the south side of Round Mountain, those are permeable sediments beneath in the alluvium through that area. So we're still moving water through that zone like we did before. The flow rates are really not a whole lot different. But what's different now, with the help of the water levels at GDEB, the help of the water levels at GDEC, which is kind of at the upper end of that darker green area that you see, we've made some adjustments in what those hydraulic conductivity values are and the rates of flow are, as well as looking again at what we think the rate of flow is to the north of Round Mountain. And from making those adjustments, we're starting to fit the water level data just as well at wells that we had it in the past, but now fitting it better at these wells where we have new data compared to what the old model without that new data had. Not sure if that makes sense, but what I'm trying to say is, after we got the new data, we plugged it in the old model and we found, oh, okay, the old model's not replicating that new data as well as we like it to at GDEB in particular, and to a lesser extent, GDEC. So some examples of that visually. The next slide shows you how we think about that in a time series sense. And that's really where we spend a lot of our time looking at the model as we do each run and think about the quality of the calibration. So this is for GDEB. And what we're looking at here, the green line all the way across the plot, and this is a time series plot, I believe from early 2020 or 2021, I can't read it, all the way through 2022. The green line is the ground surface elevation over at GDEB. The two lowest lines, the dashed brown and the solid brown, those are actually showing the open interval of that piezometer, the depth at which we've got a well screen that's collecting water in it. And that solid brown line is actually the base of the alluvium. So that's showing the elevation there. So you can get a sense of what that vertical difference is between ground surface and the base of the alluvium. The blue line was the model simulation of the water levels in the model that we had at the end of the GSP development period. The red line is what the model simulates now, and the blue dots are the groundwater elevation data that we've collected at those piezometers. These are the hand measurements. And so this next slide that we just put up on screen blows that up a little more so you can see it easier. So again, the dark blue line was the original model, And the red line is the model that we have now. And so as you can see, the old model was over predicting the groundwater levels relative to those light blue dots, which are the measured data. But the model now, the red line, is pretty much nailing those water level readings. So by installing these piezometers, collecting water level data, doing the LiDAR surveys, and improving the representation of the physical system through that area, we've been able to accomplish quite an improvement in this particular location. Let's go look at another example location, and this one we're going to go to the next piezometer downstream. This is GDEC, and so this piezometer is located about 1,000 feet downstream of the Valencia WRP's outfall for the Santa Clara River. So we're just a little ways west of I-5. And in this diagram, what we can see is that the blue dots again are the measured data. Notice that the two brown lines, this is very shallow well, so it's a lot different than in construction than the other well is. The water levels are very close to ground surface. In fact, some of them appear to be right at it, basically. The old model is the blue line, the new model is the red line. And this is an example of an area where we'd like to see further improvement in the match between the data in these areas. We just haven't quite been able to get there so far. The other thing is that because this well is constructed very differently, it's very shallow. We have to always keep in mind as modelers that we really need to think carefully about how we fit a model to the data and whether there's anything we see in the nature of the data itself that tells us, you know, oh, let's be a little careful about what modelers call overfitting the model to the data set. So for example, I've wondered a little bit if, you know, compared to the GDEB site where we know we're monitoring about a 50-foot thick section of aquifer, or I'm sorry, 25 feet, I believe it is. We might only be monitoring the very upper 5 feet or so at this location as well. So are we maybe seeing some slightly hyporheic water that's kind of the interface between the river and the groundwater system? We always want to be keeping things like that in mind. So this is an example of a well that, you know, is one place that we can be looking to continue trying to improve the model going forward, and doing so as part of that adaptive management and learning exercise that I think Rick described earlier. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Rick.
Great. Thanks, John. So wrapping up here, we've got some anticipated adjustments to the water level thresholds. And our last few slides will sort of roll this up. So John just talked about the model. We've talked about adjusting some of these values. We're not ready to provide specific recommendations for adjustment to your board. But that will come in a future meeting. And while we're rolling those together, we're still monitoring the basin and collecting information. The adjustments that ultimately we bring to your board will be consistent with the approach in the GSP. So you may see some triggers and thresholds go lower. You might see some minimum thresholds go a little bit higher. But at the end of the day, they'll be consistent with the approach in the GSP. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about process and timing. So amending a groundwater sustainability plan in our conversations with the Department of Water Resources is not that different to the public outreach and board process that's used for adopting the first plan. You know, your board is aware that we had quite a robust stakeholder process when we adopted the GSP. Exactly what the process will look like for us for amending the GSP remains to be determined. I think after we get our comments from the Department of Water Resources, we'll come back to your board with some different approaches to do the required outreach for amending the GSP. In our conversations with DWR, I appreciate their direct answer to our question on timing, which was basically, look, please don't submit any plan amendments. If you do, they may not be addressed, because what DWR really wants to see before they entertain any more plan amendments is the overall responses to their comments on the GSP. So like it or not, we're sort of hitched to doing GSP amendments, to waiting for and responding to the Department of Water Resources comments on the GSP, which is fine. I understand their position and why they want to go that route. Next slide, please. I see a formatting issue. Forgive that. So in conclusion, we've talked about the process to amend the GSP and the timing. We do anticipate revisions of thresholds and triggers. When we come back to your board with specific recommendations, we're also going to look at bigger picture issues too, to advise your board on, you know, we're focusing, we have to focus at the GSP level on these micro water level measurements at specific wells throughout the basin. But that's not really how a basin, you know, we manage the whole basin. When we come back to your board, we'll talk about bigger picture issues with the model too. You know, going down memory lane, when we developed the model for the GSP, we looked at the overall basin water budget, for example, and the overall sustainability. We'll take a look at that again and advise your board of any big picture differences. Just so you're aware, we're not going to be focused on X feet at this location next time we come back. We'll continue collecting data and learning and adapting. GDE evaluations are going to be starting up again. And next slide, please, Uni. So we need to complete the near-term flow model work. We will receive the comments from the Department of Water Resources and determine how best to respond to that and talk to your board about a process moving forward. And that's the direction we're heading with getting this going. It will be many more months until we have the comments and can develop a process to move forward. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you again, John, too.
All right, very detailed presentation. Better data, better decisions. I'm excited to see where this will go. Comments from the public?
There's none.
Okay, directors, thoughts?
Uni, could you go back a couple of slides? Let's go to the plots, the last one. Either the last one or second to the last one.
Yeah.
Okay, this one. Yes. So, question, we had the first plan close to between, 1070 and 1060. And then we would take our measurement, we've got a lower value here. Any reason why we assumed higher than what we measured? I mean, I know, was it a hypothesis? Was it based on previous data?
Yeah, and John can speak to this, but the blue line was strictly a simulated value from the flow model. And it's off, right? We can all see that. At the time that we simulated that value, we didn't have good elevation control. Our alluvium thickness was a little bit too thick in that area. Our hydraulic conductivities needed a little bit of an adjustment. And so that was the simulation in blue. And it wasn't until we drilled the boring and began to collect detail that we could better calibrate the model for this location.
Do we have enough sample size to confirm that this is the true elevation, or do we need more?
The blue dots are the actual measured groundwater elevation.
Right, and we're happy with the amount, with those values and the amount of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 6 samples taken. Or 6 measurements taken at different locations, right?
Right. Yeah, for this exercise, we're happy. That's a good calibration on that data.
I could add, Director Wachowski, what we plotted for those blue dots, those are our hand measurements of water levels that we go out. During the summer months, we're actually going out monthly. During the rest of the year, we're going out quarterly. And we're checking those measurements against those data loggers that are collecting the high frequency readings. And so that's being done partly to just make sure that everything's calibrated correctly with the data logger. So I didn't plot the data logger data on this plot because it was just going to be too busy to read. The other thing I would mention is that green line with the groundwater, with the ground surface elevation, that's the ground surface as we know it now at GDEB. But at the time that we were doing the original modeling, we had a higher ground surface in the model at that area because we were working from these coarser DEM grids compared with this much higher resolution LiDAR data that we had now, as well as the actual wellhead surveys that we had now when these new piezometers got put in the ground.
Okay. Understood. Thank you. Back to you, President Bryden.
Other comments? Director Martin.
Thank you, President Bryden. Rick and John, thank you for your presentation. I thought the board memo that was in the packet is very informative. And it discusses that all this new and more accurate information based on the flow model, based on filling data gaps, is likely to result in some adjustments. But there's no direction of those adjustments other than what you just said, Rick, about it'll still be consistent with the GSP that was adopted in terms of, I don't know what that means in terms of the trigger level being still below the groundwater levels in most cases, or are you made any conclusions in that regard? It doesn't sound like you have, other than the model is going to be more accurate and you have more data to fill in data gaps resulting in adjustment. So you have any feel for where what direction those adjustments are going to go relative to complying with the objectives of the GSP?
Yes, and I mentioned it briefly, but I'll restate it in case it wasn't clear. So 2 things. When we talk about it being consistent with the GSP, what we're talking about there is the GSP had an approach like with the GDE triggers, for example. The GSP said in this location, we'll just take GDEB. We're picking on that location a lot today, but let's just focus on that one. The GSP said at GDEB, we're going to set a trigger at X feet, which is 2 feet above the simulated historic low in that location. But what we've realized is the simulated historic low is not correct. And so moving forward, the revised value for GDEB, I expect it to be lower. And exactly how much lower, I'm not prepared to say, but it will be lower. And it will still be consistent with 2 feet above the historic low. I hope that helps.
No, that sounds good. I appreciate that. If I might, I ask one more general question with regard to surface elevations, the flow in our river, erosion during heavy storms, sediment transport. As one who's lived probably walking distance to the South Fork for the past 45 years, I've watched heavy flows go through the river, but when it dries out, it doesn't seem to change much in cross section. Is this the natural state of equilibrium that the river has achieved over all these many years? That because when you talk about a land surface elevation, is it the same next year if you went out to survey it, or the year after that, or the year after that? It seems these things do fluctuate, but in balance, the river stays pretty stable. Is that a correct observation?
I think on balance, the river does stay pretty stable. It's still within its banks, right? But this last year's storms, they really did have a large effect in the river. Channels that existed in one area for a very long time got moved away. 5 Point was telling us there was a large channel that re-established itself on the other side of the river. So it's a hard question to answer. It changes, doesn't it? And you know, we've spent a lot of time getting these dialed in, but the river elevations will change again in the future. And that's why we monitor. And that's why we do these evaluations.
And one more point, I guess maybe Russ can weigh in on this. That portion of the river that I believe the South Fork provides a flood control function, does it not?
You know, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Oh, but anyway, the structure were built along the river appear to provide some sort of flood control protection for the neighboring land and neighboring property. So there must have been some analysis made that this is going to be good indefinitely. So I guess feeds into my general observation that not much changes over the year on balance. So yeah, good to know we have a stable river. Thanks, Rick.
Director West.
Thank you, President Biden. I hope you looked back at the flows when the river, when we had the 1978 floods, which we had 49.5 inches of rain in a very short period of time. And in 69, even worse, and it took out the bridges, but the South Fork overflowed and flooded what's Lyons Avenue, completely flooded the entire street. And the drop structures had to be put in along the South Fork, so that it was channeled and drop structures put in. And if you'll stand there at Magic Mountain Parkway when we're at a high peak storm, the volume of the water coming down those drop structures is so loud you can't hear yourself talk. So it's a massive flow in out of the mountain range there where the Woodlands Park is, Oak Mountain, all of that area flows in. And so it'd be kind of fascinating to know what the change has been. We've had quite a few really good droughts and then a few floods, and everybody thinks this year was really tough, but we've had much worse weather than this year.
Other thoughts? Okay, other directors? All right, quite a bit of information, but pretty cool. I'm excited to see where this is headed.
Great.
Chair Bryden, just one thing I wanted to add on. I think Rick and John for their presentation. I think, you know, it's showing this kind of continual improvement approach, right? Which is key to this whole process. And so I'm excited about that. The more we learn about the river, more we learn about the groundwater and the surface water is going to be helpful as we manage it going forward. One of the things I did want to point out, you know, as part of the GSP development itself, we had a very robust public engagement process. And so you're going to see the staff try to think through how, if we're going to make changes to the plan, some of these they're not like principal changes, but they are moving lines and numbers and things like that. And I think it's going to be imperative that we make sure we have an engagement process when we go through and consider those things. That certainly is something the department wants to see as we go through and consider these things. Whether that's, we had a stakeholder advisory committee last time. That was a really kind of pretty extensive process, whether we need to go through something at that level or some different version of that. I just wanted you all to understand that that's something we're going to try and work through as we go through the next steps of this.
Understood. Sure.
On that aspect, Mr. Cole, what are you leaning more towards? A town hall or a 2 series of town hall with inputs, and that's it? Or I'm sure not as comprehensive as the stakeholder advisory committee.
I haven't made a choice yet. If the board has, thoughts about that, what I thought we would do is try to prepare a couple options, different options that we could consider and get comfortable with, and then go that direction. But yeah, I have not made a determination of kind of the way we did it before versus some new version of that going forward.
Would that also be driven by DWR, or is that at your discretion?
It's really at the GSA's discretion. But I will say that the Sigma kind of rules want a very robust public outreach process. So depending on how you do that, the stakeholder advisory committee was above and beyond what was required. But the group at that time felt it was going to be important to do that as our first roll out the door. There are a bunch of different ways you can do it going forward. And so I think what we'll try and do is maybe learn from some other GSAs in the state. And we know what our process was, and we can consider, a version thereof going forward.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, with that, let's move to item 5. This is the executive director's report, and I think it'll be presented by Mr. Cole.
Yes, great. Thank you, Chair. Just had an item or two here wanted to share with you all. I think I mentioned at the last meeting that the Bouquet Canyon project was up for a grant through the Wildlife Conservation Board. Happy to report that was successful. That effort was successful. It's a huge step in the right direction. That is a very large project when you start taking into account the roadway improvements that are considered. The grant award was just a hair over 12 million. This is for design and project planning and permitting. So that tells you the level of the project that is anticipated in that creek area. So that's exciting. I had the opportunity to kind of testify and support that project. A lot of work went into that grant application and it was successful. So more to come there. One follow-up to that, the supervisor is holding a public outreach meeting with the community to kind of give an update. That is scheduled for this Thursday, October 5th at 6:30 to 8 o'clock at the Grace Baptist Church up in that area. So if you want to get the very latest, feel free to go ahead and attend that. And that concludes my report.
Okay, comments, directors? Or actually, confirm me, no public comment?
There is none at this time.
Yeah, okay, Director Ford.
Thank you, President Bryden. Steve, has Water and Power been a part of the process?
Yes, thank you, Director Ford. Yes, they have been. They have taken, I think, the approach of we want to release the water. So when the creek and the road are improved, we will release the water. So, but they've been there every step of the way. Including a tour that we had out with Wildlife Conservation Board staff members. They had several representatives there and attended.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
Welcome.
Others? Oh, Director Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Cole, for your report. One would think that if we're going to spend $10 million on design, that there's expectation that there'll be money available for construction. Where did this funding come from, by the way?
The funding was allocated to the Wildlife Conservation Board
Okay, that's right.
through the state of California. I think what we are starting to work on is, kind of the next step here, of funding for the actual project, right? Which is going to be a substantial need. Our local congressman, Garcia, had put forth a $300,000 grant that went through. So that grant is directed to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we're currently working with them to see if we qualify for one of their larger grant programs. So basically, the idea would be a feasibility analysis. This is how the federal programs work. You have to go through a very rigorous feasibility analysis, of which the design would, help us get through. And ultimately, hoping that some of those funds would come available through that effort.
Yeah, I just would say if you consider typical percentage of construction that represents design, the price tag on construction is going to be quite high. So let's hope that we get some help from somewhere. It's a worthy project. Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
Other comments? Okay, if not, I think that takes us to item 6. This is director's request for future agenda items. Directors. Okay, usually we don't do public comment on this one. And I think that's going to take us to item 7. This is adjournment. I'd like to make an announcement, though, due to the holiday, the GSA regular board meeting that was planned for January 1st has been rescheduled now to January 8th. So our next meeting will be January 8th, 2024, living in the future. Okay, with that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.